In Donald Trump's first presidential term, he spoke a lot about Most Favored Nations pricing for pharmaceuticals. That is, bringing the prices that Americans pay for drugs in line with prices paid around the world. In his first term, all that talk didn't amount to much, but this time around, the pharma industry is taking the president much more seriously. I've invited Alice Valder Curran, a partner at Hogan Lovells and our go-to expert on U.S. policy and pharma, to give us an update on what's happening right now with Most Favored Nations drug pricing. Welcome to the show, Alice.
Thanks, Jonah. It's great to be here.
So today we're talking mainly, and I'm sure if there's other topics we can get into them if we have extra time, but mainly about the Most Favored Nations pricing. Sort of last time you were on, we talked about the executive order. Since then, there's been a lot more movement, a lot more conversation. So really just trying to get a sense of kind of where we are right now. Is it more concrete than it was? And in what ways is it still sort of somewhat nebulous what's happening? So maybe just start with kind of the summary of where we're at right now.
Sure. So, with a little bit of history, we go back first to April, which is when we saw the first executive order on drug pricing more generally, not specific to Most Favored Nation or MFN pricing. But then on May 12th, the president issued his executive order on Most Favored Nations pricing, exhorting manufacturers to adopt Most Favored Nations pricing and promising action on that within 30 days. Because one of the questions companies had was, well, what is the Most Favored Nations price? How do we figure it out? What drugs does it apply to? And that was relayed not by any sort of individual communication, but rather by a press release that said, or really stated, the administration's expectation around what the MFN would be, which is the lowest price among any country that satisfied a particular OECD economic standard, GDP standard. And so there was a benchmark that basically defined the benchmark price. And so manufacturers knew the price that the administration expected. What did not happen after that was a bunch of announcements from the industry saying, okay, we're doing that and here's our price. What I do think happened is that there was a lot of engagement with the administration around MFN pricing, the challenges with that, and how it is not a silver bullet, that there are a lot of competing considerations, and there was a lot of engagement. I do think that there were a lot of manufacturers who went in and met with Secretary Kennedy and Administrator Oz and their teams. Fast forward, the next announcement we had was on July 31st when President Trump posted 17 letters on his Truth Social account that he had sent to 17 manufacturers, basically saying, you're not doing what I asked, and you now need to do that or else. And those letters had 4 requests slash demands. The first was a request that the MFN price be extended to all of Medicaid. And I'll go back to each one of these or maybe you and I can talk about each one of them after I go through them. The first was extend the MFN to Medicaid across the board. The second was extending the MFN to new launches of products, and not just Medicaid, but Medicare and, importantly, commercial markets too. The next was repatriating revenue from abroad to lower prices in the US. And last but not least was a direction to participate in more direct to consumer and direct to business models for high volume products. Again, the president said, please go meet with Secretary Kennedy and Administrator Oz. They want to speak with you about it, but then made clear that if there was not progress, the administration would, quote, use every tool in the arsenal it has in order to pursue companies that don't act voluntarily, and set a deadline for those actions of September 29th. So
So
that was 2 weeks ago or so.
before we get into those 4 kind of subtopics, because I do want to go through those a little bit, what is this or else? What are these tools the administration has? Is the vagueness sort of part of it? They're trying to just sort of scare pharma by not not telling them what they're going to do. I mean, I hate to say this is unusual because this administration does 16 unusual things before breakfast, but it seems to me like in the past that we would have had a more specific threat attached to an ultimatum like this.
Listen, I can't get into the strategy of the administration about whether the ambiguity is purposeful. But even if you go back to the May 12th executive order on most favored nations pricing, that executive order did include a few of those tools explicitly. One was withdrawing FDA approval for products. Many folks looked at that and said, there are legal standards around withdrawing approval of products. You can't do that based on pricing, but that's in that executive order. There was a reference to investigations by the Federal Trade Commission on pricing practices, that is something that could be launched. After the fact, it was almost like they forgot to include it in the executive order. There was something that came out from Customs and Border Patrol that talked about tariff investigations on imported products. There's something that they could do. So those are a few, but I think it's fair to say there are a lot of folks who are thinking about what are those tools and where are we vulnerable. We can look at other industries in terms of what the administration has done. Canceling federal funding. Are there government contracts that any companies have that could be terminated? Are there visas or immigration restrictions that they can impose on key personnel? We saw them do that with the educational sector. So I think there are plenty of analogs that you can look at in the toolbox that the administration has already used with other players, and we don't know what they're going to do with that. I think the reason they're talking about those tools, however, is a separate topic we should talk about, which is why do they have to rely on those tools? Aren't there legal requirements that they can use now to impose that? And that's a separate topic to discuss.
Yeah. I mean, it almost feels like this administration is willing to use any tool at its disposal for political purposes is maybe the wrong word, but in order to advance its agenda in a way that maybe in the past there was a sense of, these things are political, these things are not. We're not going to, not approve your drug because we don't like your pricing. But it's almost like all bets are off right now with yeah.
I would say this administration is more willing to test novel legal theories and litigate them as needed in a way prior administrations were not. And that's why you see a lot of legal challenges. And again, it's not just in the pharma industry. We see this across industries where they are willing to try new theories and see if they can, work and survive judicial scrutiny.
Yeah. And I wonder if the administration feels sort of emboldened against pharma because public opinion might be on their side when it comes to drug pricing, and that oughtn't affect the courts, but in in this day and age, it sometimes does. I won't
There,
ask you to speculate on that.
thank you, thank you.
um, so okay, let's put that piece of why these novel levers instead of more traditional levers on the back burner for a second and talk about what the ultimatum is. And before we get into those four pieces that were in those letters posted on Truth Social, um, let's just talk about the price that was laid out. Prior to that, this more specific definition of what a most favored nation price is. I mean, broad strokes, looking at that, how sort of did that clarification make the specter of MFN pricing more or less palatable to pharma? I mean, was it kind of good news, bad news, or neutral news?
I would put it in the neutral category. I think manufacturers have a general sense of what their price is in these countries. One of the interesting point is that those prices may not be public. That's one of the barriers to this policy, is that it's not like WAC, wholesale acquisition cost here in the US, which is published and is effectively a public price. These prices in these European countries, it's largely European countries, not exclusively, but primarily, a lot of times they're negotiated prices with single payers in these other foreign countries. Those aren't necessarily public prices. But I think companies largely had an idea of what those prices were. This metric that the administration pointed to, I think, was similar, if not the same, as what they did in the first Trump administration. So that was something I think folks naturally thought might be the standard this time around, but it's still prohibitively low, as I think what, and so that didn't really change anything. It wasn't a surprise, but it didn't it didn't move the needle because I think folks were assuming that would be the price, and it's still pretty much prohibitively low, certainly on an across the board basis.
So, uh, in these letters on Truth Social, um, the first thing you mentioned was Medicaid.
Mhm.
Talk to me about sort of what that entails and how that's maybe different than what we might have thought was happening here with MFN prior.
Well, interestingly, remember that when the Big Beautiful Bill was under negotiation on the Hill, one of the policy proposals that did come out, and it came out before the MFNEO, was to require MFN pricing for Medicaid. That was something that the administration was pushing the that for Congress to include in that bill, and that was something that the industry, the manufacturing industry, really pushed back on strongly because of the implication, not just for Medicaid, but the spillover implications to the 340B program. Because the Medicaid rebate, which is what this MFN would trigger, that Medicaid rebate is something that ends up being considered in the 340B drug pricing program, which now is a larger program than Medicaid itself. And so you have not just the gross to net impact from Medicaid, but an even larger gross to net impact on the 340B program, and that led the industry to come push back hard on that. And it wasn't in the Big Beautiful Bill. It got pulled out, and there's a hypothesis that the fact that it wasn't included in that legislation that really motivated the administration then to issue that executive order because they weren't able to get it in the legislation itself.
Yeah,
So that is something that they tried, they didn't get. Now they're asking for voluntarily, but I think the same reason why industry pushed back so hard of it in legislation is the reason why it's really problematic to do on a voluntary basis as well.
I mean, to take a little detour here, there was virtually nothing about pharma in the One Beautiful Bill. The one thing that was the modification to the orphan drug requirement. I mean, and I kind of I didn't read the whole thing. I don't think anyone did, but I combed through it. I did keyword searches, and I really couldn't find a single thing that affected the pharma industry except for that one little section, which, considering the scope of the bill, is a little surprising.
Yeah, I mean, and it certainly was a welcome provision for some pretty important sectors of the life sciences industry as a way to encourage multiple orphan indications for products, which is something we see with a lot of products that have orphan indications. It's surprising how many of them have multiple orphan indications once you get that far. So yeah, so that's sort of the history of the MFN for the Medicaid population and why if they push back that hard in the Big Beautiful Bill, I don't see it changing, them doing it on a voluntary basis either.
I want to be mindful of our international listeners who maybe don't always immediately know as well as we do the difference between Medicare and Medicaid. Obviously, Medicare is the subject of the IRA drug pricing negotiations. But maybe just really quick, if we could talk about sort of when we talk about Medicaid, we're talking about the states, right?
Right. So the Medicaid program is the program for low income individuals in the states. It is funded both by the federal government and the state government. And there's a statute that says drug companies, if you want the Medicaid program to pay for your products, you have to agree to give those states a discount every time that they pay for your drug. And the statute ties that discount to your lowest commercial price, aptly known as your best price in the commercial market. So the lower your best price to any customer in the commercial market, you have to match that discount to the Medicaid program. And the concern was if manufacturers have to extend the MFN price to Medicaid, that will set best price and that will lower it for not just all of Medicaid, but because there is a separate program known as the 340B program, which manufacturers also have to participate in if they want Medicaid to pay for their products. And that program is actually larger than Medicaid. That program also requires effectively the same price as Medicaid. So if you're offering the MFN to Medicaid, you're having to offer it to even a bigger program known as the 340B program as well.
Got it. Thank you for clarifying that. I'm American, you're American. We're very steeped in this stuff, but I do have to remind myself sometimes that we've got a great many readers around the world. So I don't want to be too inside baseball all the time. Um, Newly launched drugs. So that, to me, like I guess I kind of would expect that to be included in MFN by default. Is this just a matter of sort of specifying it, or is this a uh, new request?
It's not new, but this is where I'm going to talk about the realities of how this could happen. And first of all, the letters ask for this pricing on newly launched drugs for Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial payers, commercial insurers. And I want to focus on that last bit because the federal government has nothing to do with the price set in the commercial sector. And so that's a really big ask to extend that pricing, not just to the programs that the federal government pays for, but the programs where private employers and private insurers are paying for it. And there's no legal framework in our country right now for that. Medicaid, we talked a little bit about already. On Medicare, there are two parts of Medicare. There's Part B as in boy, which is for physician administered drugs, typically drugs that are administered in the hospital setting or in the physician office setting. And there's no legal framework for manufacturers to offer discounts directly to the federal government for Part B drugs today.
Hmm.
There isn't one. And for Part D as in dog drugs, which are drugs that are dispensed in pharmacies, so typically self-administered drugs, those prices are negotiated on the government's behalf by insurance companies that contract with the federal government to effectuate the Part D program. So again, there is no direct government negotiation for Part D prices either. And I raise that because the letters say, go do this. And one of the challenges for making that a reality is there is no legal framework for doing this. And so maybe that's what the secretary and the administrator want manufacturers to come up with. There is a framework for the government to do experimental arrangements that maybe could facilitate this sort of thing for Medicare, really primarily. It occasionally can be for Medicaid, but it's typically for Medicare. They're called demonstration projects. So there is a statutory framework for demonstration projects so that you could maybe come up with ways to do the kinds of contracts that the president is asking for here, but it doesn't extend to commercial. And even those experimental arrangements require some process around them. They can't be done by fiat. They require some regulations, it requires stakeholder feedback, it requires time to implement. And so, even if a manufacturer wanted to do this on some level or on some scale, there are barriers to doing that beyond a press. You can do a press release saying you're talking about it, but there are barriers to actually making it a reality that the laws in this country impose.
Yeah, interesting. Um, so just trying to decide. That's kind of potentially taking us on another road, but let's get through these other
Yeah.
two provisions real quick. Um, so there's this increased revenues for American patients and taxpayers abroad, right? And then we'll do that, and I think direct to consumer probably deserves its own little conversation too.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this third one is I'm going to focus on some language in the letter that talks about increased revenues abroad must be repatriated to lower drug prices for American patients. And the reason I'm focusing on that language is because of a deal that was in the news in the chip industry that came out, the first couple weeks of August about NVIDIA and AMD agreeing to repatriate to the federal government 15% of all the revenues that they get from selling AI chips to China. And these letters came out less than 2 weeks before that NVIDIA and AMD deal was announced, and I can't help but wonder,
Mm,
and that chip deal is talking about repatriating funds that the Chinese are paying to these companies for chips, whether that was what the administration had in mind, that somehow manufacturers are supposed to enter into deals with the US government that says we're going to give you some of the revenue for whatever we sell abroad. Now, that may be the model, but some key differences are these chips to China couldn't happen without US government approval. There's no such gating item that I know of that the government can impose on selling drugs in foreign countries. So it's not clear how you repatriate it, and it also is unclear because the prices in Europe are lower than the prices in the US. So it's repatriating income on lower prices is also a bit of a conundrum. But I can't help but wonder whether that kind of model is what the administration was thinking of here, given that we saw this chip deal come out in the press and have exactly that kind of structure so soon after this letter came out.
Mm. So that, yeah. So that is sort of like a sorry, that is sort of like a convincing way to read between the lines, at least of
Maybe
what this might mean.
I think
Yeah.
we were all scratching our head when we read that about what exactly does that mean. We can understand what sort of somehow extending this pricing to Medicare and Medicaid is. Repatriating money is a little different. And my hypothesis, but it is a n of one, is that maybe they were thinking about something that was clearly under negotiation at that point with the administration, although in a very, very different industry.
But that was also quite controversial, right? That
Exactly, and press reports suggest that it's unconstitutional. There could be constitutional challenges to it, and that's all of a piece, right? We've already covered in the first couple of topics how there's no statutory basis for a lot of what the administration is asking manufacturers to do, that there might be some framework out there for doing something experimental, but there are process requirements around that. At least there we have a framework for experimenting in the Medicare program and somewhat in the Medicaid program as well. I don't know if such experimental authority exists in the context of those sales of AI chips to China.
so finally, direct to consumer. This is interesting, right? Because this has been sort of a pretty big trend in pharma up until now. Um, it feels in this context like it's almost um, just sort of rounding out, right? Like making sure that this is going to apply everywhere where it's relevant. Um, but it's interesting to see the government sort of like pushing for direct direct purchasing, right? And we haven't really seen that before.
No, we haven't. And in fact, as you noted, I think this is the one component of the letter where there is some precedent in the market for how to do that. My sense is that because of that and it's doable, this is probably the easiest item or most attractive of the items for manufacturers to be able to say to the administration, "Hey, we are doing this. We see that you want us to encourage, or you want to encourage us to engage in direct to consumer price reductions. We are doing that, whether it's through the sort of telehealth model of having pharmacies that ship directly to patients on manufacturers' behalf, as we see with maybe some of the GLP-1 products, or even if it's just increasing patient coupon arrangements so that if you're a cash paying patient, you get a lower price through a manufacturer sponsored coupon. Those are, at this point, relatively well trodden pathways that manufacturers are aware of, know how to do. But there's an interesting policy consideration there as well. When this model really became more common with GLP-1s, it was largely because there was a lack of insurer coverage for it. And so patients were already in the cash market for it. They weren't expecting their health insurance to pay for it. And so direct to consumer made a lot of sense because the patients wanted the product. They wanted the products even if they didn't have insurance coverage. And so a model was created to facilitate that. If you create that model for products where there is insurance coverage, you are creating a perverse incentive around whether payers should continue to cover that product. Because if patients are able to get the product at a lower price, at a low price if they pay cash for it, but what if that cash price is still higher than what the patient would pay if they had insurance coverage under their copay program. And so I worry about some perverse payer coverage incentives that these direct to consumer models can have, because it could incentivize health plans to not cover things, because then it saves them money. Patients still get the product, but patients end up potentially paying more because they're not getting the
Mm,
benefit of the insurance coverage that they should have for that product if it's paid for through that route.
yeah. So it's one thing to sort of voluntarily disintermediate the payers in certain cases where it makes sense for pharma, but it's another thing to kind of force pharma to offer that option, which kind of upsets the ecosystem in a different way.
Right, and it takes the pressure off the health plans to actually do what health plans are supposed to do, which is de-risk coverage and help cover out of pockets. And it could launch a whole separate discussion, Jonah, around PBM reform and payer reform, which we could spend a lot of time talking about on a different
I mean,
podcast.
couldn't you argue that direct to consumer discount programs like GoodRx have the same problem?
Potentially, potentially they do.
You're already seeing high deductible health plans starting to say, "Oh, just use," like literally saying in their materials to their to their members, just use GoodRx. And it's
Yeah.
like, okay, well, yeah, I see what you're saying. Um, okay, so I'm glad we kind of went through that. That was a really really helpful context, and yeah, there's always so much buried beneath the surface here in terms of the potential outcomes here. Um, let's maybe talk a little bit about where we are right now vis-a-vis the politics of this, because there have been conversations between pharma and the administration. I mean, there is engagement happening. Um, there, like, without being able to see the future, does it seem like there's productive conversations happening? Do you think we're going to end up in some sort of compromise between pharma and the administration, or
I really don't know, because I I think that this problem that the president wants to solve is not solvable with a silver bullet solution. There are a lot of complicated legislative or statutory dynamics governing these programs, as well as marketplace dynamics. And even comparing prices in the US to the prices in Europe, for example, is complicated because most of those markets are single payer markets. And you have a single government agency that is negotiating the price and has the market power to set the price for the entire country. And here in the US, we have multiple federal programs that all act independently in determining what their price is. You have Medicare B and D, you have Medicaid, you have the Department of Veterans Affairs, and then you have state programs individually as well. They all have their different regulatory regimes and different requirements. And then you have the commercial plans. And then within those marketplaces, you have stakeholders who have perverse incentives around low list prices, which is what the MFN would be, is just lowering your list price. And that is inconsistent with the model that most PBMs favor. They tend to favor higher WACs with bigger rebates to get to a net price that's low as opposed to a list price that's low. Even under the Part B program, there are certain dynamics where the physician and provider community has various incentives based on what the price is charged. So that is why there is no easy solution to this. And so I think we might have some movement around the edges. I definitely think we're going to see more and more direct to consumer programs. We see things like the Lilly announcement of its intention to raise its prices abroad, in part to address that. You see manufacturers focusing more on onshoring their products, their product pipelines, their supply chains because of the tariff solution, or tariff lever that we can also talk about. So there's a lot of thinking being done around this. There's a lot of conversation with the administration. And as I mentioned before, there are some sort of experimental programs that maybe could be tried. But in terms of a across the board agreement to MFN to large segments of the market, that's really, really hard to do. And it's really, really complicated. And so I would be surprised if we see the kind of movement that the president would like to have. We may see some. I mean, I don't know. I have no special knowledge, but I it is
What do you
way
make
more
of the news?
complicated than a one-page letter suggests, and so it's gonna be way more complicated to solve it, I think.
So, what do you make of the news that Eli Lilly is you know, setting its prices in the UK? I mean, it's a pretty, as you say, it's not they're not doing the whole thing, but it is a small nod in that direction. And it feels a little unprecedented to be making pricing decisions in another country based on U.S. policy like this.
Well, I do think that the administration is also focused on making sure that other nations are paying their fair share. So I think Lily's statement is completely aligned with what the president has said about that. And I think that in some ways this helps US manufacturers when they are negotiating prices with these foreign governments have a reason for why they need prices that are higher than those governments want to provide. When they're in these pricing negotiations, this is almost certainly part of those negotiations going forward is manufacturers saying, a little bit like in the US right now, when manufacturers are negotiating prices with commercial health plans, they will say, hey, I can't give you that big of a discount because it will set best price for Medicaid. And if I give you that price for on a commercial price, I'm going to have to give that same price to the entirety of the Medicaid population and the 340B program as well. It's not worth it for me to do that. I can see manufacturers having a very similar conversation now with foreign governments that could provide the benchmark price for the MFN is, I'd love to give you that price, or maybe in prior days I could, but now there are these much greater implications of me giving you this price because of the MFN initiative that the administration is proposing, and that is just going to keep us from being able to agree to that price because of the MFN implications. I mean, and that would be an honest, that would be truthful. That wouldn't just be a negotiating position, that would be a truthful position that the manufacturers could use in those negotiations. So I do think that that is going to be happening if it hasn't already started.
So I think we're about at our time here, and I know there's a lot more we could talk about, but I think that note is a good one to end on. I mean, there's a I think a tendency, and I don't say this as a dig, of the Trump administration to be willing to attempt sort of brute force solutions to problems that former administrations have been very delicate with. And I think in some cases, that boldness is going to be rewarded, but in some cases, the problem is actually that complex, and no amount of sort of willingness to like you say, no amount of letters on social media changes that innate complexity. So I guess, yeah, we have to wait and see. I
Yeah,
suspect that when all of this blows over, there will have been some effect on the disparity between U.S. prices and world prices, but I suspect it won't reach the level that the administration is asking for.
to me, I think we should revisit this. Well, I'm sure we'll be talking iteratively as developments occur. But now that this topic has become such a focus, whatever happens in the near term with the Trump administration on MFN, it's not going to go away at the end of this administration because now this is something that's received so much focus. Congress certainly is aware of it, and whichever party you're in, it's going to be something that they're focused on. So I'm not quite sure where this will end up, but even if it is not the subject of executive orders and letters from the Trump administration going forward, or if there is some sort of resolution, I think we will be continuing to talk about this and seeing it as a basis for recommended policy reforms by those who continue to focus on this sector in the future.
Well, I think let's end it there for now. But yeah, I enjoy that we're able to keep sort of checking in as things change and things are changing and developing so quickly. It's always a pleasure, Alice, and thanks so much for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Jonah.
That concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments, at pharmaphorum.com/podcast. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Podbean, and pretty much wherever else you download your podcasts. Just search for pharmaphorum and follow and hit subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit the website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins, and follow us on Blue Sky and LinkedIn at pharmaphorum. That's PharmaPhorum. That's all for now. Thanks for listening.